Modernism was an international cultural movement which affected the literature and the arts in the first decades of the 20th century. Modernists were against tradition and Western values. They interrupted the father to son transmission of classical knowledge, literature, arts, and science. This way of thinking was influenced by new scientific discoveries such as Einstein's theory of relativity, the new quantum mechanics by Max Planck, and the psychoanalysis of Sigmund Freud. The First World War caused a generational clash between the old generation, guilty of horrors such as imperialism, and the younger generation, who was forced to fight a war they couldn't understand. All these factors brought to the end of positivistic faith in science and progress. There is no faith in future, but also no consolation in the past. The only thing that matters is the present. Modern poetry began with imagism, invented by the American poet Ezra Pound. Imagists used the clear and precise image, which the poet represents and shows, often in very short but effective poems. Pound followed the tradition of haiku poems written in Chinese and Japanese. The most famous example is In a Station of the Metro by Ezra Pound, which is a two-line poem with only object on the front, and no verbs, no action, just still a picture which can be placed anywhere at any time. Pound's rules for writing an imagist poem are direct treatment on the thing, and to use absolutely no word that does not contribute to the presentation. So, Pound's poem has the honor of being the shortest famous poem in modern poetry. Pound walks through the streets of Paris and sees crowds of people pouring out of the subway. This seems to him to be figures that come from the world of the dead. It is as if the inhabitants of Hades were coming up to occupy what is the world of the living. The title functions as a locator. It tells us where we are. We are in the Paris underground, in a station of the metro. The poem was actually longer, but it cutting down and eliminated words, coming down to these two final lines. And these also come from a piece from a perception of life. The truth is something you reach only by cutting away the rhetorical ornaments. Pound wrote also the cantos. The cantos foregrounds the act of singing history, not as a story of progress, but history rather something like the poem itself, something that accumulates and repeats itself with variation and without a definite aim in view. History in this sense is something that can't ever be completed either. Pound wants to gain access to culture and voices from the past. He wants to identify with them. In an act of translation, Pound wants to make it all new. In Pound, there is the idea that there are no dead forms. There are no dead languages. There are only variation translations through which the past is continuously being made present. In his poem The Cantos, Pound wishes to create a poem that would include history. So, on the one hand, you have the poet of In a Station of the Metro, the shortest poem in modern poetry, and then you have the poet of the Cantos, the longest poem in modern poetry. Pound is both of these things. The Cantos is a great religious poem, an account of man's progress from the darkness of hell to the light of paradise. The hundreds of people who inhabit the Cantos were all born into the darkness of hell. We have three groups of people. The first one who enjoy their hellish state and remain the same. The second one who experience a metamorphosis and desiring to get out of darkness are drawn to follow a vision of fire and light, and the leaders of the mass moving towards the land of light. In one of the cantos, with Dusura, Pound criticized the American Revolution, which broke out with the purpose of freeing the 13 colonies from dependence on England, but which ended up reproducing the British system in politics, in particular by building in the United States the equivalent of the Bank of England. After arriving in Italy, Pounds finds that Mussolini could be the Jefferson for Italy. Jefferson was the man who tried to stop the degeneration. So Pounds say that the usury is the cancer of the world, which only the surgeon's knife of fascism can cut out of the life of the nations. So Pound criticizes the economic process. Before capitalism, the process was commodity model commodity. Now one can buy in order to sell it at a higher price, leading to the commodity money process. The product is sold on the market at a profit that is controlled only by the capitalist. Money becomes capital and therefore an end in itself. So we have the heterogeneity of ends of Hegel. So the aim of the capitalist becomes the never-ending movement of profit-making, without any defined purpose, but making more and more monies, which has Rapand called usury. So usury is the act of loaning money in return for the same money with interest, or the process money. Unlike Ezra Pound, who translated the material and the voices coming from the past, T.S. Eliot preferred the quotation. The difference between these forms, translation and quotation, is a way to understand the differences between Pound and Eliot. Pound aims to make it all new. A translated phrase from the ancient Chinese has to be perceived as alive, modern, and contemporary. On the other hand, we have Eliot, who wanted to honor the voices from the past. Eliot wanted to represent the spiritual sterility of the modern world through a constant comparison with classical voices, which he called the mythical method. Eliot's poetic method is based on the use of the objective correlative, a set of objects, images, and references that evoke a particular emotion, and only that one. Eliot raised also the impersonality of the artist. He criticizes the traditional novel, the fact that the speaking voice of the poet was central. This is a wrong way of making poetry, because, as Eliot says, the poet's task is not to say but to show. His task is not expressing his feelings, but showing what already exists outside of him. Now, the poet's task is representing real objects, real situation that the poet has not created. Eliot wrote The Wasteland. The fragmentation of Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, is one example of modernist poetry and represents the fragmentation of Western civilization. In fact, the 20th century can be considered as a heap of broken images. It represents a world that has been radically destroyed and made sterile by war and its consequences. What remains of the mythical past is a desolate post-war land in which life is paralyzed and the future is uncertain. So Eliot's view is deeply nihilistic. There are no clear signs of hope for the entire Western world. So the only way to make sense is posing a constant comparison between this sterile and meaningless present and a mythical and meaningful past. So this is the mythical method. James Joyce was born in Dublin in 1882. He studied at a Jesuit college and he was supposed to become a Catholic clerk, but he said no to religion, to family, and to his country. In fact, he left the Jesuit college and gave up the idea of becoming a priest. He chose to become an artist, and to do that, he decided to leave Dublin as the center of a cultural paralysis. He and his wife so moved to Trieste, and he got a job teaching English. He made friends with his Los Vivo, and when World War I broke out, he moved to Zurich, and he died there. Ireland was the center of the paralysis, because Irish people were passive or unable to rebel against the British rule. Joyce wrote Dubliners, that is a collection of 15 short stories about people living in Dublin who were oppressed by British cultural imperialism. The dominant theme of the 15 short stories is the failure to find a way out of the paralysis. Each short story opens in medias res, when the life of the protagonist is about to reach a turning point. This critical moment is called an epiphany. An epiphany is the sudden manifestation of a hidden or removed truth, a fear or a secret wish. It is caused by an external object, an unexpected situation, a song or an image. After the epiphany, the character changes his understanding of himself and the reality around him. One of these 15 stories is Evelyn. Evelyn is the story of a young woman abused by her alcoholic father. Evelyn's world is dominated by male figures. Another male character is the sailor Frank, who is presented in clear opposition to Evelyn's father. The story is divided into three sections. In the first section, Joyce introduces the reader to Evelyn. In the second section, we meet Frank. Frank invites Evelyn to follow him and make a new life in Buenos Aires. This is the central conflict of the plot. In the third section, Evelyn deals with her interior conflict when it comes to making a decision. She has the chance to live to Buenos Aires with her boyfriend Frank, but she hears a song that reminds her of the melody she heard on the day of her mother's death. And that is the epiphany. Evelyn promised her mother to look after the house and keep the family together. She wants to keep her promise, but at the same time, Evelyn realizes that the illness of her mother is the result of the terrible life she was forced to live. Her mother represents what Evelyn could become if she decides to stay in Dublin and to continue to suffer the domestic abuse of her father. So Evelyn is paralyzed in her horrible life because she can't choose. So, despite her name recalls Eve, the first sinner, the first woman who chose and suffered the consequences of that decision, Evelyn is a victim, a small, unfit Eve, and that is an example of the mythical method of Eliot. Another story of Dubliners is The Dead. Gabriel Conroy is a college professor and a literary critic. He embodies what Joyce would have been if he had not escaped Dublin. Gabriel and Greta, his wife, are at a Christmas party at Gabriel's house. On that night, Greta hears a traditional Irish song that reminds her about a guy, Michael Fury, who used to sing it and who died for her love when he was 17. Greta seems to be very distant and moved. Gabriel asked her, what did he die of? And Greta says, I think he died for me. Greta's answer is a real epiphany for Gabriel. At first, Gabriel is shocked that there was something of such significance in his wife's life that he never knew about it. And in second, he has never had anything or anyone to live or to die for. His life suddenly appears to him for what it is, empty and meaningless. So Michael is the only character who dies in the story, but he proves to be the only person who has truly lived. Joyce wrote also a portrait of the artist as a young man. That is an autobiographical story of Stephen Dedalus, that is an alter ego of Joyce. Stephen is a young Irish writer who rebelled against his family, his religion, and his nation. His name refers to Saint Stephen, who is the first Christian martyr, and Daedalus refers to Daedalus, who escaped the labyrinth using wax wings. So Stephen Daedalus is a martyr for art, because he goes on a voluntary exile to France to break the rule and live his life as an artist. Another masterpiece of Joyce is Ulysses, where Stephen Dedalus returns to Dublin. He has failed as an artist. Now he is only a simple teacher. The story is set in Dublin on a single day, June the 16th, 1904. Stephen has lost his father figure. Simon Dedalus has cut him out of his life. Another Dubliner, Leopold Bloom, an advertising canvasser, suffers from two emotional crises: the loss of his father and of his son, and the infidelity of his wife, Molly. So Stephen, Leopold, and Molly correspond to Telemachus, Ulysses, and his faithful wife Penelope. According to mythical method, the 20th century version of Homer's characters revealed the clash between a mythical, meaningful ordered past and a fragmented, meaningless present. So Joyce used the myth. He made a constant parallel between antiquity and present time. Every character, every episode is linked to the Odyssey. Samuel Beckett was Irish. He was influenced by French existentialism and in particular by Camus and Sartre. He wrote in two languages. He was a mother tongue English writer, but he knew French very well. When he wrote Waiting for Godot, he did it in French because he hates the English. And it was an instant success, but later he translated it into English, and he won a Nobel Prize for Literature in 1969. The historical background of absurdism, that is, of the theater of the absurd, is World War II. There was a revival of theater of drama in Britain after the Second World War, and this new form of drama showed a general rejection of traditional values, and two main trends rose in this post-war drama: anger and absurd. The theater of anger first, called Angry Young Men, who were educated playwrights coming from a middle class or working class, so they generally supported socialism. Formally, they did not create innovative plays because their plays were realistic and they were traditional, but they were innovative with regard to content. The second form of theater was the theater of the absurd, under the influence of Camus and Sartre. That is, the influence of existentialism. The theater of the absurd is based on the pessimistic view of man's existence. The main themes of Beckett's plays are the sense of man's alienation, the cruelty of human life, the absence or the futility of objectives, and the meaninglessness of man's struggle. So we say that Samuel Beckett's masterpiece, Waiting for Godot, was not written in English, but it was first written in French as an attendant Godot. The general setting of Beckett's plays is that all the characters are trapped in a situation from which they cannot escape. Actually, it's an absurd situation. In traditional drama, there is a story developing in time. There is a setting in place and time, and the society is portrayed through realistic characters who move, who act in a definite period of time. On the other hand, Waiting for Godot has no story and no plot. Nothing ever happens in Waiting for Godot. On the stage, the characters speak, but they do not really communicate. They do not really act. They don't do anything. In Waiting for Godot, there is no developing in time. There is no past, and there is no future. Waiting for Godot is a two-act play, but there is no difference between the first act and the second one. Both end with a young man who tells Vladimir and the protagonist, that Godot will come the following day. All we can see is a country road and a beer tree. That is, it can be anywhere, anytime. It's a symbolical setting. We didn't know who Godot is. Actually, Beckett never said it was God, but this is what the characters do. They just wait for Godot, and it's the main theme of the action. All we know about the characters is that they are tramps, so there is no defined personality, no social class, they just symbolize an existential situation. The characters represent two different aspects of the same personality. Gogo represents the body, and Didi the mind. So Estragon, Gogo, reminds us of physical activities, and in fact, he has problems with his boots. Uh, Vladimir, that is the one who speaks, is more intellectual, and in fact, he always plays with his head. There is another complementary couple, Pozzo and Lucky. Pozzo is the master, the oppressor, and Lucky is the power of the mind, but he is the slave. In the second act, the role is reversed. Pozzo is blind and needs Lucky, who has become dumb. So Pozzo and Lucky may remind us of Hegel's master-slave relation. When the characters speak, they are often contradicted by the stage direction. For example, when Vladimir says, "Well, shall we go?" and Estragon agrees, they cannot move because there is a stage direction. Waiting for Godot and the theater of the absurd in general is pervaded by a grotesque humor that is irony about everything because everything is meaningless.